The morning they came for me started like every other morning on Harlan Ridge. I was up before the sun, the way I'd been every day for the past 22 years. My boots hit the cold wooden floor at 4:47 a.m. I know because I checked the clock, the way old habits die hard, and I padded to the kitchen to start the coffee before heading out to check on the horses. The land was still dark and quiet, that beautiful kind of quiet that only exists in the 40 minutes before dawn when the whole world seems to be holding its breath. Frost clung to the fence posts. The big bay gelding, Copper, snorted a white cloud into the air when I pushed open the barn door. Everything was exactly as it should be. I want you to understand something about that morning, about that version of my life, because it matters. It matters in a way I couldn't have articulated back then, but understand completely now. I was not a wealthy man. I was not a powerful man in any conventional sense of that word. What I had built myself into over 2 decades of 5 a.m. mornings and bloody knuckles and loans I wasn't sure I could repay, was a man with land. 63 acres of ridge property in the foothills of Western Virginia, passed down to me partially from my grandfather and purchased in parcels over the years with every spare dollar I could scrape together. I ran a small cattle operation, kept horses, rented 2 pastures to a neighboring family for their sheep, and grew enough on the back 40 to keep my pantry full and give away to anyone in the valley who needed it. That land was my life. Not a metaphor. My actual life. The development came 5 years before that morning. That's the part of this story people always want to skip past, but you can't skip past it if you want to understand what happened. You have to understand what it felt like to watch it unfold. In 2019, a developer named Partridge Holdings purchased the old Whitmore Farm, 140 acres adjacent to the eastern edge of my property, and began carving it into a planned residential community they called Whispering Pines Estates. I had no objection to that, not philosophically. People needed places to live. New neighbors weren't inherently a problem. What I didn't fully appreciate in those early years was the creature that tends to emerge when you put 200 families with expensive homes and a lot of anxiety about property values into close proximity and hand them a governing document. What I didn't appreciate was the HOA. Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association was established in 2020 with bylaws, a board of directors, an architectural review committee, a landscaping standards committee, and a compliance and enforcement division that, I would later discover, had more teeth than a junkyard dog and about as much temperament to match. At its helm, elected by a vote of 127 homeowners in the spring of 2021, was a woman named Diane Colworth. I want to be careful here, because I'm not the kind of person who enjoys speaking ill of others, and I'm aware that everything I say reflects on my own character as much as hers. But I also want to be honest with you, because honesty is the only currency this story trades in. Diane Colworth was, in the plainest possible terms, the kind of person who had discovered, late in life, that institutional authority was a drug. She was in her mid-50s, recently retired from a career in pharmaceutical sales, and she had moved to Whispering Pines with her husband Gerald and a golden retriever, and an almost evangelical belief that the difference between a good neighborhood and a great neighborhood was rigorous enforcement of community standards. I didn't know any of this yet, that morning with Copper and the frost on the fence posts. I was still just a farmer checking on his horses. The knock came at 8:15. I was at the kitchen table, second cup of coffee, going over a feed order when I heard it. 3 sharp, deliberate raps on my front door that somehow conveyed, even through solid wood, that whoever was on the other side was not there to borrow a cup of sugar. I opened the door to find a woman I didn't recognize standing on my porch in a blazer that was somehow both too formal and too thin for the November air, holding a manila envelope with the precise, two-handed grip of someone who has practiced the gesture. "Mr. Harlan," she said. Not a question. That's right. I'm Diane Colworth, president of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association. She said it the way a general might announce a rank. I'm here to formally serve you with notice of violation and the associated schedule of fines. I looked at the envelope. I looked at her. I looked past her at the long gravel drive, where I could see a silver Lexus SUV idling with the exhaust curling up into the cold air. Gerald, presumably, keeping the seat warm. I'm not a member of your HOA, I said.
Simple fact.
Stated plainly. Her smile didn't waver. If anything, it sharpened. You are adjacent to our community, Mr. Harlan, and our governing documents extend certain standards and obligations to properties that share infrastructure and access with Whispering Pines. I'd encourage you to review the enclosed documentation carefully. She held out the envelope. Here is the thing about moments like that one. There is a version of yourself that wants to refuse to take it. That wants to tell her to get off your porch and drive her Lexus back to whatever subdivision meeting had convinced her she had jurisdiction over a man whose family had worked this land before the word subdivision existed. There is a proud, stubborn, righteous version of yourself that wants to make a stand right there in the doorway. I took the envelope. Not because I was afraid. Because I was raised to respond to paper with paper, to fight formal with formal, and because something in her smile, that particular quality of absolute, unquestioned certainty, told me this was not a woman who had come to have a conversation. She had come to deliver a message. Inside the envelope was a formal notice of violation citing my unscreened agricultural equipment storage visible from community access roadways, my unpermitted fencing within the shared corridor easement area, and a catch-all clause about aesthetic incompatibility with community standards. The total fine listed at the bottom of the second page, in bolded black ink, read, $25,000. $25,000. I sat back down at my kitchen table. The coffee had gone cold. Outside, I heard the Lexus pull away down the gravel drive. And somewhere deep in my chest, in a place I don't usually let things reach, something that had been patient and quiet for a very long time began, slowly, to wake up. I didn't sleep that night. I want to say I handled it with grace, that I set the envelope on the table and went about my day with the kind of stoic calm that farming teaches you over the years. And I did go about my day. There were cattle to feed and fences to check and a broken hydraulic line on the tractor that had been waiting for my attention for 2 weeks. My body did what it needed to do. But my mind was somewhere else entirely. $25,000. I need you to understand what that number meant in the context of my life at that moment. It wasn't abstract. It wasn't a figure on a wealthy man's balance sheet that could be absorbed with mild irritation and a call to a financial advisor. $25,000 was, in very concrete terms, the difference between a good year and a year that broke you. It was 6 months of operating costs. It was the emergency fund I'd spent 3 years building after the drought in 2017 nearly took everything. It was the number that, if it disappeared, would put me in a position where I'd have to make choices about this land. Hard choices, the kind that kept men like me awake at 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling and trying to remember why they hadn't just sold when the developer first came calling. And for what? For what? I pulled out the violation notice again after dinner and read it 3 more times in the lamplight, the way you reread a sentence that doesn't make sense, hoping the words will rearrange themselves into something logical. The equipment storage charge cited my tractors and implements, which I had parked in their customary location beside the equipment barn, the same location where my grandfather had parked his equipment and his father before him. The fencing charge referenced a stretch of split-rail fence along the eastern pasture boundary, a fence I had rebuilt with my own hands in the summer of 2020. The aesthetic incompatibility clause was so vague, it could have meant anything. It essentially did mean anything, I realized. That was the point. I called my neighbor Roy the next morning. Roy Deason had been farming the adjacent property for 30 years and knew this valley the way most people know the inside of their own homes. I told him what happened. There was a long silence on his end of the line. "Diane Colworth came to your door," he said finally. It wasn't quite a question. "You know her? She came to the Whitfield property 2 months ago. Same kind of notice. Different reasons, something about their barn being an eyesore. They paid $2,000 just to make it go away because they didn't have the energy to fight it." Something cold settled in my stomach. She's done this before. Tom Whitfield isn't the only one. I've heard of at least 3 others. One family on the Ridge Road paid close to $8,000 in fines over the course of a year. They sold and moved. Harlan. Left land their family had owned since the 80s. I sat with that for a long time after I hung up the phone. 3 families. Maybe more. People who had been worn down not by anything legitimate, not by any real violation of any real law, but by the accumulated weight of official-looking paperwork and the willingness of an organization to spend other people's money on legal threats. It was a machine, I realized, an efficient, merciless machine designed to produce a single outcome: compliance or departure. Diane Colworth hadn't come to my door to resolve a neighborhood dispute. She had come to start a process whose end was as predictable as gravity. Either I would pay, or I would be buried in enough legal and financial pressure that paying or leaving would eventually seem like the easier option. I'm not a man who frightens easily. I've pulled a calf in a January blizzard. I've renegotiated a bank loan with a lender who didn't want to renegotiate. I've sat beside my father's bed in his final weeks and held his hand and told him this land would be okay, and meant it, and kept that promise. But that night, I'm going to be honest with you, I was frightened. Not the sharp, immediate fear of physical danger. Something slower. The particular fear of a man who sees a threat he doesn't yet know how to fight. The second notice arrived 11 days later. It was not a follow-up on the first. It was an entirely new violation, this time citing unpermitted commercial activity, because I had allowed the neighboring family to pasture their sheep on my property in exchange for a rental payment. Activity that had been taking place for 7 years. Activity that had nothing to do with Whispering Pines or its HOA or its community standards or Diane Colworth's opinion of my aesthetic compatibility. The fine on the second notice was $8,500. Then the harassment started. I use that word deliberately, carefully, because I'm aware it carries weight. But I don't know a better word for what the following 6 weeks looked like. A white sedan. I eventually identified it as belonging to a man named Phil Garrett, the HOA's appointed community compliance officer, began appearing on the road adjacent to my property too, sometimes 3 times a week. Just parked there. Watching. I would come out of the barn and see it at the end of the lane, idling. I would drive past it on my way into town, and the driver would make deliberate eye contact in the rearview mirror. It was surveillance theater, designed to make me feel observed and judged, and I'd be lying if I said it didn't work. My attorney, a man named Douglas Fry, who had handled my property transactions for 15 years, reviewed both violation notices and gave me his honest assessment over the phone. The commercial activity claim is almost certainly overreach, he said. Agricultural rental arrangements between adjacent landowners have a long legal history in Virginia, and your zoning clearly supports it. The aesthetic complaints are softer, harder to fight because they're subjective, and the HOA's governing documents are written to give them a lot of discretion. Can they actually collect $25,000 from me? A pause. Not automatically. They'd need to pursue it in court, or through a lien if their documents allow for it. But Harlan, that process is expensive and miserable, and it's designed to be. The calculus they're counting on is that fighting costs you more than paying. I thanked him and hung up. I walked out to the back pasture in the late afternoon and stood at the eastern fence line. the fence they'd sighted in the first notice, and looked out across my land in the fading light. 63 acres. Every inch of it earned. Every fence post I'd set myself or watched my father set before me. I thought about Tom Whitfield signing a check for $2,000 just to make the machine stop grinding. I thought about the family on the Ridge Road who had sold and moved away from land their family had held for 40 years. And then I thought about something else. Something that had been sitting at the edge of my memory since the day Diane Colwith stood on my porch. Something I hadn't been able to bring fully into focus until that moment, standing at the fence with the cold coming in off the hills. It was something my grandfather had told me years before his death, on a day we were walking the property lines together. Something about the road. Something about a transaction that had taken place before I was born, before the development, before any of this. A transaction so old and so buried in county records that I had never had reason to think about it. I turned and walked back to the house. I had some research to do. The Harlan County Clerk's office opened at 8:30 a.m. I was parked outside at 8:15 with a thermos of coffee and a legal pad, and the kind of focus that comes from not having slept particularly well for 2 weeks. The clerk, a woman named Mrs. Patricia Ames, who had worked that office for longer than I'd been alive and had the institutional memory to prove it, looked up when I walked in and gave me a nod of recognition.
"Harlan," she said.
"Haven't seen you in here in a while." "Research day," I told her. "I need to pull everything you have on deed history and recorded easements for my parcel. And anything related to Whitmore Farm and the road parcels in that sector. Going back as far as the records go." She looked at me for a moment over her reading glasses with the particular expression of a woman who has seen a great many people walk into county records offices and who has learned to read what they're really looking for beneath what they say they're looking for. "I'll get you set up in the back room," she said. What followed was 8 hours that I will remember for the rest of my life. Property records in rural Virginia counties are not organized for casual browsing. They exist in layered systems, some digitized, much of it not, that require a particular kind of methodical patience to navigate. Deed books, plat maps, survey records, easement filings, recorded instruments going back in some cases to the mid-1800s. I had pulled records before for my own transactions, but always targeted, always narrow. This was different. I was looking for something I couldn't fully name, following a thread my grandfather had given me decades ago without knowing what it connected to. The thread began in 1961. My grandfather, Earl Harlan, had been engaged in a boundary dispute with the then-owner of Whitmore Farm, a man named Cecil Pruitt, over the access road that connected both properties to the county highway. The road in question was a gravel lane approximately a quarter mile in length, running northeast from Route 7 through what was then Pruitt land before reaching the edge of the Harlan property. Earl had used that road his entire life. Cecil Pruitt had, at some point, decided that constituted a liability and attempted to restrict access. What happened next, what I found in a deed book from 1963, in handwriting I had to bend close to the page to read, was this: Earl Harlan didn't fight the easement dispute. He bought the road. He purchased outright, for a sum of $400, a strip of land 12 feet wide and approximately 1,340 feet long, the entirety of the access lane from the Harlan property to Route 7, from Cecil Pruitt. The transaction was recorded, properly, with the county. The deed was there in the book, witnessed and notarized. Earl Harlan became the owner of that strip of land, a private road parcel, in September of 1963. And that ownership had passed, without interruption, through the estate to my father and through my father's estate to me. I sat back in my chair and stared at that deed for a long time. The access road from Route 7 into what was now Whispering Pines Estates, the road that 200 families used every single day to enter and exit their community, The road that their delivery drivers used, that their guests used, that the school buses used, that the HOA's own compliance officer drove to come and park in front of my property, was built on the same corridor as that 1963 road parcel. When Partridge Holdings developed Whitmore Farm in 2019, their surveyors had platted the new community access road, and the county had permitted it. But underneath the pavement, underneath the county permits, was a recorded deed in my name. I pulled the development plats. I pulled the 2019 survey records. I laid them on the table beside the 1963 deed and the original plat of the Harlan parcel. The overlay was imperfect but unmistakable. The new Whispering Pines access road did not merely approximate the old corridor. In its central section, approximately 800 feet of it, the critical 800 feet between the county highway and the community entrance, it ran directly through my recorded parcel. I thought about Diane Colworth on my porch with her manila envelope and her practiced smile. I thought about Tom Whitfield's check for $2,000. I thought about the family on the Ridge Road who had sold and moved away. I called Douglas Fry from the parking lot of the county clerk's office at 4:47 p.m. "Douglas," I said, "I need you to cancel your tomorrow morning." There was a beat of silence. "What did you find?" "I think I own the road into Whispering Pines." Another silence. Longer this time. Then, slowly, "Tell me everything." I talked for 40 minutes in that parking lot. The sun going down behind the ridge, the cold settling in around the truck. Douglas Fry, a man I had never once heard raise his voice, a man whose entire professional demeanor was a kind of controlled legal patience, interrupted me only twice. The second time was to say, quietly and with great care, "Harlan, if the survey overlay holds, this is extraordinary." I drove home in the dark. I did the feeding late. Copper pressed his nose against my shoulder in the barn the way he does when he senses something is off, and I stood there with my hand on his neck and let myself feel the full weight of what the day had given me. Not triumph. Not yet. I was too careful a man for premature triumph, and I'd learned the hard way that the distance between a legal discovery and a legal victory was a long road with a lot of ways to get lost on it. But there was something. A feeling I hadn't had since Diane Colworth knocked on my door. A feeling like solid ground beneath my feet after weeks of sinking. A feeling like a door in a dark room, where before there had been only wall. Douglas confirmed the survey overlay 3 days later, working with a licensed land surveyor he trusted. The correlation wasn't perfect. The new road was graded wider and slightly realigned from the 1963 parcel in certain sections, but in the critical central segment, the legal record was clear. The Harlan parcel ran under the road. What that meant, legally, was nuanced. Douglas was careful to explain the nuance, but the core of it was this. Partridge Holdings had developed that road in 2019 without ever conducting a proper title search sufficient to identify the 1963 instrument. They had assumed the corridor was clear. They had been wrong. No easement had been negotiated, purchased, or recorded with the Harlan parcel. No right-of-way had been established. Which meant, depending on how a court viewed the situation, that 200 families in Whispering Pines estates were using a private road without a valid legal right to do so. And the owner of that road, the quiet, early-rising cattle farmer they had decided to fine $25,000 for parking his tractors where his grandfather parked tractors, was me. I sat with this knowledge for 2 more weeks before I did anything with it. That was the hardest part. Not the research, not the legal analysis, not even the weeks of harassment that continued uninterrupted, the white sedan, the notices, a third violation letter that arrived citing excessive dust generation from unpaved areas for a fine of $3,200. The hardest part was sitting on what I knew and not moving until the moment was right. Because I understood something my grandfather had understood about land disputes and the people who start them. The one who moves first doesn't always win. The one who moves right does. I needed Diane Colworth to take one more step. I needed her to be absolutely, publicly, irreversibly certain that she had won. The certified letter arrived in the 4th week of December. It was from the HOA's attorney, a firm in the city called Braddock, Stern and Associates, and it was formal in the way that expensive law firms are formal, which is to say that it used a great many words to convey a simple threat. The substance was this: the accumulated fines now totaled $36,700. I had 30 days to pay or contest, and if I failed to do either, the HOA would pursue enforcement through the county circuit court and seek a judgment lien against my property. A lien against my property. Against the land. I want to be careful here not to perform an emotion I didn't genuinely feel, because I think you deserve the real version of this. What I felt when I read that letter was not the hot, reactive anger of a man who's been insulted. It was something much older and much colder. It was the feeling of a man who has been patient for a long time watching someone make a very serious mistake, not because he has tricked them into it, but because their own certainty has blinded them to everything they haven't bothered to learn about him. I called Douglas Fry and told him it was time. What Douglas had prepared, what he had spent the better part of 6 weeks building with the careful architectural precision that made him worth every dollar he charged, was a legal response of a particular kind. Not a defense. Not a counterargument to their fine schedule. Something else entirely. Something that addressed not what they had done to me, but what I had discovered about them. Or rather, what I had discovered about the ground beneath their feet. The response was a formal letter, sent certified mail to Braddock, Stern and Associates, to Diane Colworth personally, to the full board of directors of Whispering Pines Estates HOA, and this was Douglas's particular genius, to Partridge Holdings Development Corporation. The letter opened by acknowledging receipt of their enforcement notice and declining to pay the fines. That part was expected. The part that was not expected came 3 paragraphs later, when the letter introduced Deed Book 47, page 312, recorded with the county clerk on September 14, 1963, the instrument by which Earl Harlan had purchased the road parcel, and the survey analysis demonstrating its overlay with the current Whispering Pines access road. The letter did not make threats. Douglas was insistent about this. It stated facts. It noted the absence of any recorded easement, right-of-way agreement, or license with the current holder of the parcel, meaning me. It noted that Partridge Holdings, in its 2019 development approval process, had represented to the county that all necessary title issues had been resolved. It attached the relevant section of that representation. It noted that this representation appeared to have been incomplete. And then, the sentence I want you to understand was not cruel, was not performative, was simply the most precise possible statement of the legal reality. It noted that the holder of the parcel reserved all rights with respect to the use and access of said private road, and that any further legal action against the Harlan property would be vigorously defended, with all available legal remedies pursued in response. All available legal remedies. On a road that served 200 homes. We sent it on a Thursday afternoon. By Saturday morning, I had received 3 phone calls I did not answer from a number I didn't recognize. By Monday, Douglas had heard from Braddock, Stern and Associates, a different attorney than the one who had signed the enforcement letter, Douglas noted, which itself told a story. By Tuesday, I had received a message through Douglas from Partridge Holdings requesting an urgent conversation. I want to tell you about one other thing that happened in those days because it matters to the texture of the story and because I think it reveals something about Diane Colworth that I couldn't have predicted. She denied it. Not to me, not yet. But to her board. To her community. In the days after a letter landed, as word began to filter through Whispering Pines the way word always filters through tight communities, imperfectly, dramatically, with the volume turned up on every detail. Diane Colworth apparently told her board members that it was a bluff, that our lawyer was on a fishing expedition, that the deed was probably invalid or had been superseded by some later instrument, or that the county would sort it out in their favor. She was so certain.
I have thought about this a great deal since then, about what it takes to be that certain,
about the particular kind of confidence that comes not from knowledge, but from having never been seriously wrong before, from having run the same play over and over, fine after fine, family after family, and having it work every time. I don't think Diane Colworth was a stupid woman. I think she was a woman who had confused a streak of victories with invulnerability. And I think, somewhere beneath the certainty, she had never seriously considered the possibility that the quiet farmer at the end of the lane had anything she needed to be afraid of. That was the mistake. Not the fines. Not the harassment. Not the legal threats. Those were all symptoms. The mistake was the assumption, the foundational, load-bearing assumption, that she knew everything relevant to know about me and my land, and that what she didn't know didn't matter. My grandfather, Earl Harlan, had paid $400 in 1963 for a strip of land 12 feet wide and 1,340 feet long. 62 years later, sitting in my kitchen with a cold cup of coffee and a certified letter from an HOA attorney threatening to put a lien on my property, that $400 was about to become the most consequential real estate transaction in the history of Whispering Pines Estates. The meeting was held on a Tuesday evening in January. It was not the meeting I had requested. I had made no request for any meeting. The meeting was requested by Partridge Holdings, organized by their attorneys, and held in a conference room at a law firm in the city, neutral ground, as their attorney put it when Douglas relayed the invitation, with a studied casualness that didn't quite conceal the urgency underneath it. Douglas and I drove up together. I wore the same jacket I wore to my father's funeral, which is the only piece of formal clothing I own that I can say with certainty fits correctly. Douglas wore his standard dark suit and the expression of a man who has been in many rooms like this one and has learned to treat them all with equal, measured calm. Across the table, the two senior partners from Braddock, Stern and Associates, a pair of in-house attorneys from Partridge Holdings, a risk management consultant whose precise role was never explained, and Diane Colworth. This was the first time I had seen her since the morning on my porch in November. She looked different in a conference room than she had on my front steps. The blazer was heavier, the posture more deliberate, but something in her eyes had changed. The absolute, weaponized certainty I had seen in that first encounter had been replaced by something that was working very hard to look like certainty and not quite getting there. The Partridge Holdings attorney opened with a lengthy preamble about the complex history of property law in the Commonwealth, the good faith nature of the 2019 development process, and the company's commitment to working cooperatively with all neighboring landowners. It took him 11 minutes to say, essentially, that they had a problem and they knew it. Douglas let him finish. Then Douglas opened a folder and placed 3 documents on the table.
the deed,
The survey overlay. The 2019 county filing in which Partridge Holdings had certified clear title. My client has been patient, Douglas said. He's been patient through 3 violation notices, a cumulative fine schedule exceeding $36,000, 6 weeks of what I'll characterize generously as aggressive compliance monitoring on his private property, and a certified legal threat against land that has been in his family for 70 years. His patience is not unlimited. The Partridge attorney started to speak. Douglas raised a hand. I'm not finished. The survey analysis has been reviewed by 2 independent licensed surveyors. The deed instrument is valid and unambiguous. My client is the owner of record for the road parcel in question, and no easement, right-of-way, license, or other instrument conveying legal access to that parcel exists in the county records. What does exist is a county development filing from 2019 certifying that all title encumbrances had been resolved. I'll leave it to your clients to discuss among themselves what that filing means for their respective exposure. He closed the folder. The silence in that room lasted approximately 8 seconds. I counted. It was the kind of silence that has actual texture to it, that you can feel pressing against your skin. Then the Partridge Holdings attorney asked, very quietly, what my client's position was. Douglas looked at me.
This was the moment we had discussed.
I want the fines dismissed, I said. All of them. Every notice, every violation, every dollar of the fine schedule dismissed in writing. I want a formal written acknowledgement from the HOA board that my property operations are consistent with all applicable standards and that no future enforcement actions will be taken against my property without a written finding from an independent legal review. And I want a recorded access easement for the Whispering Pines entrance road drafted and approved by my attorney, a proper, permanent easement, fair market terms, with provisions that prevent any further HOA enforcement actions against my property as a condition of its grant. A long pause. And if those terms are not met? I had thought about this answer for a long time. I had thought about what a less measured man might say in that moment. I had thought about what it would feel like to describe in detail what the absence of that easement would mean for 200 families trying to get to their homes. Then we continue the conversation in court, I said. With the county, with the relevant regulatory bodies, and with the homeowners of Whispering Pines, who I suspect have some opinions about how thoroughly their access road was investigated before they bought their properties. The meeting lasted another 2 hours. Diane Colworth said almost nothing for the first 90 minutes of it. When she did speak, it was to ask, in a voice carefully stripped of its earlier authority, whether there was any flexibility on the easement terms. Douglas answered that question. I was looking at her face when she asked it, the specific quality of it, the way it had lost the architecture of certainty and become something more human and considerably less comfortable. That was the moment I had been working toward. Not the money, not the legal victory, not the easement. That moment. When the woman who had come to my door with a manila envelope and a practiced smile, who had fined 3 families into leaving land they loved, who had watched from the warm interior of a Lexus while her compliance officer parked outside my barn, when that woman had to sit across a table and ask me for flexibility. The terms were substantially as I had requested. Douglas negotiated small modifications on the easement language that were actually improvements. The agreement was executed in writing within 3 weeks. All fines dismissed. Formal acknowledgement, signed by Diane Colworth as board president. Easement, recorded with the county, terms favorable to the Harlan parcel, permanent. But here's the part of the story I have not yet told you. The part that came after the lawyers and the conference rooms and the signed documents. The part that happened in the community, in Whispering Pines Estates itself, where 200 families had been paying HOA dues in part to support an enforcement apparatus that had been threatening their neighbor with $36,000 in fines while simultaneously sitting on an unresolved title defect that could have disrupted access to their own homes. When that story came out, and stories like that always come out, the response was not quiet. Spring came to Harlan Ridge the way it always does, slow and muddy and irresistible, the frozen ground giving way to something softer, and the first green appearing on the south-facing slopes before the north ones are willing to admit the season has changed. I was out early on the first morning that genuinely felt like spring, mid-March, cool but not cold, the light arriving before 6 a.m. for the first time in months, walking the fence line along the eastern pasture, the fence that Diane Colworth had cited in her first violation notice. The split rail posts I had set with my own hands. The rails my father had showed me how to notch. I walked the whole length of it and found it exactly as I had left it, solid and true, and I stood at the corner post where the pasture opens toward the ridge and watched the light come up over the hill in that particular way it does in March, where everything looks like it's being lit from the inside. I had received a letter 2 weeks earlier. Not from an attorney, not from a law firm. From the Whispering Pines Estates HOA Board of Directors. The new Board of Directors, elected in a special meeting in February following what the community newsletter, which a homeowner named Sandra Myers had apparently been running for 3 years with considerable dedication, called A Period of Significant Governance Concern. Diane Colworth had resigned as HOA president in late January, 9 days after the signed agreement was recorded with the county. The specific circumstances of her resignation were not something I was party to directly, but Roy Deason, whose sources in that community were better than mine, told me that a recorded board meeting in which she had assured members the deed issue was a bluff had been played back in full at the special meeting, with some commentary from the Partridge Holdings attorney who had since made his own feelings about the situation privately known to board members. The homeowner vote on the special meeting agenda had been, by the count Roy relayed to me, 186-3. The letter from the new board was brief and written in a register almost precisely opposite to every document that had preceded it. It introduced the new president, a retired civil engineer named Robert Ashe, expressed the board's regret for the previous administration's actions toward the Harlan property, and noted that the board had voted to establish a new policy requiring independent legal review before any fine exceeding $1,000 could be issued to a non-member property owner. At the bottom of the letter, there was a handwritten note from Robert Ashe personally. It said, "Mr. Harlan, I grew up on a farm in the Shenandoah Valley. I should have paid closer attention to what was happening on this board before now. I'm sorry I didn't. We'd like to be better neighbors." I read that note 3 times. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't moved by it, because I was, and I think the honest truth of how I felt matters as much as any other part of this story. I was angry for a long time during this, genuinely, deeply angry in the way you only get when something threatens the thing you have given your life to. But anger is not the thing I wanted to keep. Anger is a fuel, not a destination. What I wanted, what I had always wanted, even when I was sitting in a county clerk's office for 8 hours reconstructing the property history of a strip of gravel road, was not to defeat anyone. It was to be left alone to farm my land in peace, the way my grandfather had, the way my father had, the way I intended to. The Tom Whitfield family called me in February. I hadn't known them well before all of this, but Roy had connected us after word spread through the valley about how things had resolved. Tom Whitfield was a quiet man, a retired schoolteacher who had been farming a small property since his mid-40s, and he told me he had paid $2,000 to the HOA 18 months earlier to make a violation notice go away. I should have fought it, he said. I knew it wasn't right, but I didn't think I had anything to fight back with. Most people don't, I told him. That's what they're counting on. Douglas Fry filed a separate legal action on behalf of Tom Whitfield and 2 other property owners who had paid fines under the previous HOA administration. The basis was not complex. The HOA's own governing documents that Diane Colworth had presumably read many times, contained a provision in Section 14, Paragraph C, that limited enforcement authority against non-member adjacent properties to issues of shared infrastructure maintenance, a term that had been quietly and consistently interpreted to mean whatever Diane Colworth found inconvenient. An independent legal review of the prior violations found that none of the fines issued to non-member properties over the prior 2 years met the standard articulated in the HOA's own documents. The settlement, reached in April without litigation, returned the paid fines to each of the 3 affected families, with a modest additional payment for legal costs. The total amount returned to those families was just under $14,000. Partridge Holdings, for its part, negotiated a separate resolution regarding the 2019 county filing. I'm not at liberty to discuss the specifics of that resolution, as it included a confidentiality provision that Douglas advised me to respect. What I can tell you is that the resolution was substantially in my favor, and that the access easement recorded against the Harlan parcel now carries terms that will benefit this land for as long as it exists. I think about Earl Harlan sometimes when I walk that eastern fence line. A man I knew only in the last years of his long life, a man who smelled like machine oil and hay and spoke in the slow, deliberate cadences of someone who had learned that words were worth more if you didn't use too many of them. He paid $400 for a strip of land in 1963 because a neighbor tried to cut him off from the road he had always used, and he did not do it out of greed or strategy or any vision of future leverage. He did it because he was a man who understood that land and access and the legal documentation of both were not abstract. They were the actual substance of a life, the architecture of everything you built and everything you left behind. He couldn't have known, in September of 1963, what that deed would mean 62 years later. He couldn't have known about developments and HOAs and compliance officers in white sedans or $25,000 fine schedules. He just knew that a man should own what he uses, and that what you own should be recorded and clear and undisputable, because the world has a way of testing those things when you least expect it. Douglas Fry sent me a bottle of bourbon after the settlement was finalized. A good one. Wrapped in brown paper with a card that said only, Earl Harlan would have enjoyed this. I poured 2 glasses that evening. One for me, and one I set on the porch rail the way my father used to, for the people who weren't there anymore but had never quite left. The sun went down over the ridge. Copper stood at the fence in the lower pasture, calm and still in the fading light. The road at the end of my lane, my road, properly recorded and properly documented and properly mine, lay quiet in the evening, waiting for whoever needed to use it, available because I had decided it should be. That's the thing about this story that I hope you take with you when it's over. It isn't really about an HOA or a fine schedule or a woman in a blazer with a practiced smile. It isn't even about the deed or the legal strategy or the satisfaction of watching certainty collapse in a conference room. It's about a strip of land 12 feet wide and 1,340 feet long, purchased for $400 by a man who understood that you protect what you love by knowing what you have, and that the knowledge you carry in your family, in your documents, in the careful preservation of the things that matter, that knowledge is not passive. It is patient, and patience, given enough time, has a way of becoming the most powerful thing in any room. I finished my bourbon. I went inside. The next morning I was up before dawn, boots on the cold floor, coffee on the stove, the way it had always been and would continue to be. Some things, it turns out, cannot be taken from you. Not when you know what you own. The road is still there. The fence is still there. And the land, all 63 acres of it, is still mine.